Cool. Over to Lukas for your introduction. Thank you. And thanks again, Lukas, for your time today.
Thanks for organizing this. So I'm originally from Switzerland. Now I live in the UK. Working in effective altruism has somehow brought me here. I got interested in these topics in about 2012, maybe a bit earlier, depending on how you count. So I started a university in 2011, and I studied philosophy, or I eventually dropped out to focus on EA projects, but I began studying philosophy after reading Practical Ethics by Peter Singer. And I was very fascinated by moral philosophy and finding out what is sort of the right moral theory. And for me, that was initially at least a bigger driver even than sort of being altruistic in sort of what I think about day to day. So a lot of people start reducing suffering because they hear about poverty and they're just moved by people suffering. And nowadays that's the same for me. But back then I was actually kind of detached from things and just really fascinated with philosophy, basically, and just reading Practical Ethics. I felt like there were still open questions, and I just started discussing it with people I met in this context online. And then through this, we formed like a group of effective altruists in Switzerland. And we if you discuss moral philosophy the whole day, at some point you feel like a hypocrite not actually doing something. And then we started various groups and projects, and so yeah, we basically did effective altruism Switzerland, it was called first. It was the Swiss arm of effective altruism. We ran political initiatives on increasing the budget for global poverty reduction. Getting rid of factory farming in Switzerland was a big one. We're also like introducing vegetarian and vegan food options. We did fundraising for effective charities. Also, one project was in a poker context, which is a hobby of mine. And then we got famous poker players on board. And we got into this like whole research side and cost prioritization when we started to realize that there is quite some controversy over what it means to do the most good, and yeah, how that's to be understood, and population ethics, and whether it's important to create happy people and focus on like extinction risks, or whether it's important to reduce like suffering risks. In that context, a big thing for us was discovering Brian Tomasik's online writing, and we teamed up with Brian. He's the author of Essays on Reducing Suffering, for people who don't know, and has like hundreds of really, really good essays on there, and has been writing about these topics for really long before we got into it. And he was kind of a mentor, and we convinced him to quit his job and become a full-time researcher at that time. And then we tried to find more researchers so they could, together with Brian, make progress on how to best reduce suffering risks. And yeah, so my personal interests are writing about philosophy, and my values are suffering focused. So I wrote a lot about that. But I was also interested in meta-ethics because as someone with suffering-focused values, I quickly realized that not everyone in effective altruism shares those values, and some people even thought these values could be a bit, I don't know, annoying to have around or dangerous. And so there was quite, for me, the question was, should it be my main goal to either be convinced that I'm wrong, or I have to try to convince other people about what's right? And then should I just keep writing about philosophy and keep trying to, get the time of Toby Ord or Nick Bostrom or McCaskill and talk about philosophy with them? Or is it maybe the case that anti-realism is true and we just have to coexist and accept our differences and collaborate and cooperate. And I actually was a moral realist at first, but then I changed my mind on that. And that partly made it easier to have this conflict, because then we could just be like, well, we both have to find ways to collaborate on the things that are important from both perspectives. And so I've written a lot about that. And I've also written things about S-risk reduction, what to do there in practice. I haven't really come up with great ideas, but I wrote like articles on what I would do if I were smarter and knew more about artificial intelligence, how to get better background to work on these topics. Because I think many of the biggest risks of the future sort of directly relate to AI. And so I wish I had a background to work on that more directly, but I did some conceptual reasoning about ideas in that space and shared it with people who now work on these topics, although often they don't have the exact same values as I do, but they still want to take it into consideration, because everyone cares about reducing suffering to a great degree. It's not always the single priority or the absolute top priority for everyone. Yeah, I think that's it for an introduction.
Thank you, Lukas. I will exercise my privilege as the facilitator of this Q&A session by asking the first question. Doing the readings for this week, I felt like it was quite a kind of emotional and visceral and upsetting experience reading chapter 4 of Magnus Vinding's book, Suffering Focused Ethics, which has some pretty graphic descriptions of severe suffering, and reading Brian Tomasic and the horror of suffering. And it was a reminder to me about how bad suffering is. And actually, in that chapter, Magnus writes about this. He writes, I'm always unpleasantly surprised by how bad it is when I experience even just borderline intense suffering. I then always get the sense that I have no idea what I am talking about when I discuss suffering in my usual happy state, although the words I use in that state are quite accurate. That it is really bad. And yeah, I've been thinking about this and the role of emotion and emotional connection with suffering. And you said early on, Lukas, in your career, you didn't really have that emotional connection. It was a real philosophical interest, and it's only later that you developed that emotional connection. But could you speak a little bit about the role of emotions, of emotional connection with suffering in particular, in your work, and for those of us who are or would like to be effective suffering reducers?
Yeah, sure. So I fortunately have the privilege that I never feel like I experienced really extreme suffering personally, but I agree with Magnus's sentiment. Even just when I have like a bad flu, it really reminds you that suffering is very bad, and the flu, it really isn't that bad compared to a lot of things. But I think I became more reflective, which probably happens to a lot of guys, sort of at the age of early 20s. I just started thinking more about like other people's perspectives. I was quite interested in literature at some point and reading various books. I think Dostoevsky is on your reading list, where there are scenes about suffering that started to resonate more with me, and that some of that was actually even before I got very interested in Peter Singer. But then obviously once you think about ethics and practical ethics, probably the main way in which I connected with these like stories and pictures of extreme suffering was animal ethics. And then just watching videos about animals in factory farms really like gave a strong moral urgency and a sense of motivation, and doing that the work I was doing, or at least planning to do at that early time, I hadn't yet done very much, just felt like, yeah, this is very important and meaningful, and I need to get out there and do something. Yeah.
Thank you. Should we go to the audience now? I mean, I've got a couple of Slack questions which I've submitted to you before, Lukas, but maybe we can get a question live from someone. Feel free to just raise a hand using the emoji, or just raise your physical hand, or just turn your mic on whatever you like.
Oh, hey, Lucas. My name's Paul. I was just curious, you mentioned your anti-realism, and that it almost sounded like the shift from being a moral realist to an anti-realist helped you just focus on the practical ethics side of things and made you be more collaborative in the practical application of ethics, and maybe let you stop arguing as much theoretically. Is that kind of what I'm getting from you?
That's partly right, although it also turned out that instead of arguing directly about ethics, it just pivoted, and then now I was arguing a lot about anti-realism instead of the direct thing, or about moral uncertainty, for instance, because a lot of people say that you shouldn't be too confident about a particular moral view, and then sometimes this comes attached with sort of the recommendation that in practice you should still work on the things that people with symmetrical views always work on, because of like option value arguments or things like that. And then there's some of the arguments just got shifted, and then I spent a lot of time sort of clarifying my view on why moral uncertainty is like only goes so far, and it depends a bit on the person. It's a bit like you could be morally uncertain whether you want to be altruistic or egoistic and to what degree, but you can also just make a decision, and it feels like we have the information to make that decision. And it would be a bit weird to just say, I continue to be uncertain about it and just gather my resources for option value, but I'm not donating, or I'm not spending much of my time working on stuff. And I think the difference is only gradual. And sure, population ethics is more complex than just deciding whether you want to be altruistic or egoistic. But I think the difference is less, it's not an entirely separate category, I think.
And just one follow-up question, if I may. Have you read The Feeling of Value by Sharon Hewitt-Rowlett?
Is it a book? Because I feel like I've read something by her, but it may have been like a dissertation or a paper instead of the book version. So I read texts by her, but I haven't read the book.
Okay, it's basically a book form of her PhD dissertation about her normative qualia form of moral realism. I just thought that was really good and interesting in the anti-realism debate. But again, I'm like, I don't even know if that stuff really matters at this point. But yeah, it's just interesting philosophical stuff, or if it really would affect like what we do in practice. But yeah, I don't know, because you're in it. I'm like, do people spend a lot of time like, wait, we really actually want to figure out? Because like Peter Singer is a realist, but then like Brian Tomasic is an anti-realist, and I'm pretty sure Magnus Vinding is a realist. So I'm like, I guess in practice, these people obviously can collaborate in a robust way. But yeah.
Peter Singer at the time used to be an anti-realist, and then he changed his views, which was quite interesting for us, because he was quite the idol, and then we had to reconcile the fact that he has now shifted to a different camp. But I got the impression that EAs have become a bit less ambitious about figuring out what's true, not only in normative ethics, but even in meta ethics. I meet a lot of people who just have the attitude that these things are complicated, philosophers disagree, and so therefore it's not really their place to look into it. And there's a lot of like sort of almost learned helplessness in EA about these topics, and I think that's unfortunate. And maybe what's going on here is that back when I discovered effective altruism, there wasn't that much to read, and you could really, if you spend like a month reading obsessively, or maybe like 3 months, you could really read basically everything that has been written in these whole areas, and then you feel like you're allowed to form opinions, right? But now it's the movement that's been going on for like 10 years, and then when you're new to it, you feel overwhelmed. couldn't even read everything, even if you wanted to, in a realistic time scale. And then maybe people have just grown sort of passive, but that's not necessarily rational, because not everything that's like, the people nowadays aren't dumber than the people. If anything, they're probably smarter, because there are more people now. And so I think it's an interesting selection effect, and I think it does something to you psychologically when you feel like you can be at the cutting edge of something versus not. But I don't think that should actually determine whether it's okay for you to form your own opinions about these things. And I think one of two things has to be true. Either me and others in the early days were like too ambitious and too overconfident to form like strong views on these topics, or the people currently today are making a mistake by just saying that there's too much disagreement and they're not an expert, and therefore they're sort of just accepting some kind of state of uncertainty.
Awesome, thanks.
Thanks, Lucas. I see David has a hand up. Do you want to ask a question, David?
Hey, Lucas. Yeah, on the issue of moral uncertainty, I'm curious about, how confident you are in suffering focus ethics broadly, and if it sort of gives you any pause that, it's relatively unpopular, or maybe you challenge that premise, or that most people don't seem to be suffering focused, most philosophers or even everyday people.
Yeah, so I mean, I'm basically as confident about it as I am about wanting to be, well, I was going to say wanting to be altruistic, but that's sort of a cash thought. And I have to admit, I haven't been that altruistic in the last couple of years, because I got married and I'm doing less EA work now. And so this part of my identity has maybe suffered a bit of accidental goal drift, mostly because my social context is now different. But like, if you had asked me like 3 or 4 years ago, I would have said like, I try to do like 90% of my work and effort is going into things that I believe make up the most impact. And I think that's a reasonable choice you can make. And sort of similarly, I think there are just different ways or different meanings of the term doing the most good. And when I think about why do I get up in the morning, what's the thing I want to do, the idea of bringing new people into existence just feels less appealing to me than preventing intense suffering. And that, I can justify this with a lot of thought experiments, or right, like elaborate philosophical theories about tranquilism, or various person affecting views or whatever. But I think ultimately it's more about just which facets of reality motivate me to put in the effort. And in that way, I'm pretty confident that I'm suffering focused. But I do have to say I'm not, I don't consider myself a negative utilitarian. Like, there is some sense in which I consider the negative utilitarian axiology quite appealing. But I also think people's life goals are important and should be respected. So I have sort of a view on which these two things matter. And that makes, I consider that still suffering focused, but it also means that I do want existing people to survive and even to live like really long lives if they care about that. And on my view, that's important. It's just other things are comparatively important too. And new people for me, only possible people for me don't count in my personal view.
Thanks,
Thank you.
David,
and then the fact that other people don't seem to have this view, at least to me, what do you think about that?
Right. Yeah, so I don't know if you all know Wei Dai, who has written a lot about moral uncertainty and has sort of a stance that many people have to believe that peer disagreement is important to respect, but there are also people who think, it's called modest epistemology, when you think you should always defer to other reasonable people when they disagree with you. And there are some issues with that. So Eliezer Yudkowsky has written a whole small 5-post sequence against modest epistemology. And I just happen to side with that. And I think there is a bit of a regress problem where if you always defer to a sort of neutral consensus or sort of an uncertain position whenever there's disagreement, what about this meta question of should you take other people's disagreement into account? Like some people say yes, other people say no. If you're uncertain about it at that level as well, what in the end is your actual reasoning? And so I think it's not necessarily the safe position to just say, let's be prudent, let's not be overconfident. I will defer to others. And also the experts themselves often have a confident view one way or the other. And then if you're like if you look at, for instance, philosophy of mind, like the experts are often, one of them is a confident functionalist or like a eliminativist, and the other expert is like a qualia realist. But there aren't that many experts who are themselves uncertain. And so, like, out of all the positions to end up in, why would you pick the one that no expert actually has, namely being sort of undecided when the experts themselves are actually confident? So there is a bit of a tension there, and I just want to sort of point to that tension in why I think my stance is justified.
Thanks, Lukas. We're going to go to a question asked in the Slack. The first one, which is from Ricardo, who can't make it today. Ricardo asks, how do you value future lives versus lives today? Do you do any form of discounting of future lives? And if yes, how exactly does your algorithm for discounting work?
So I do value them the same, but obviously in practice, there's just so many things we're uncertain about that for like these practical reasons, I feel quite uncertain about how future lives can be affected and stuff. But if I was confident that there will be a population of people or animals who will exist for sure, I would count them the same for like the altruistic part of my life goals.
Nice, thanks. Let's go to a question from you guys. Live question. Again, feel free to raise emoji hand, raise your actual hand. Yes, Helen.
Hi. How many human beings in the world, like what percentage of our current global population do you think experience the kind of suffering that we are discussing in this course?
I'm not sure. The main thing I think of when I hear your question is this post by Scott Alexander, How Bad Are Things?, where he uses his experience as a psychiatrist and looks into general statistics about how common various afflictions are. Like things he talks about is like people being, he only focuses on the US, but he looks at things like people in poverty, below the poverty line in the US, and people with terminal illnesses, chronic illnesses, things like gambling problems or other like alcohol addiction, stuff like that. And he creates like an algorithm where people randomly get associated with one of the things, and then he reads 10 or 20 different sort of fates that come out of this algorithm. And it's quite striking how many of them have like several things wrong with them, or things that create a lot of suffering in someone's personal life. And then he also says that there are various things that don't even show up in those statistics, but can also be like really bad. Like an example of one of his clients where she felt like her grandchild was kind of extorting her for money or something, and that wouldn't really show up in a statistic, but it can be really bad for your well-being. And So the point I'm trying to get to is, I think most of us effective altruists live in quite a strong filter bubble where even just by having gone through like university education or being like in a position to think about these ivory tower topics sometimes, even though they're not ivory tower in the sense that we want to work on things in the real world. I think effective altruists can be quite out of touch in how hard it is for a lot of people, probably not like more than 10% of people or 20%, but I think maybe 10% of people have it really quite hard, probably even in the US. And then sure, extreme suffering. I don't know. I haven't recently read the examples that Brian Tomasic or Magnus have in their book, which I think is basically torture level suffering. But yeah, even there, some of these things can come up more frequently than some people would think. I'm thinking about things like extreme forms of child abuse or child sexual abuse, or it can think it's probably more than 1 in 1,000, but I'm not sure.
Yeah.
And also there are parts of the world that have war zones and stuff, and obviously there it's probably 1 in 3, or I don't really know.
Yeah. Thank
Thanks.
you.
Let's go to Jose.
Thank you very much. I was wondering, because you said at the beginning that you're not purely negative, and I was thinking that it might be worth it to do a little bit of outreach within like effective altruist circles about suffering focus that are not purely negative, because it seems that is something that puts a lot of people off, and I don't think that in practice it makes that much of a difference being like suffering focus in many ways rather than just purely negative. So I was wondering, what are your thoughts on that, and whether you think it's like worth it to put forward a kind of view of like more ecumenical suffering focus ethics, and because it's like nearly your positioning, as you said.
Yeah, I think that's reasonable and probably effective. I feel like some of my writing, in my view, accomplishes that, although I'm often surprised that when you read, for instance, my piece on tranquilism, which is a suffering-focused view, it makes it clear in the introduction that it's meant as like one building block to put your views on. But then if people summarize it, or if they associate it with me, they still think I'm a negative utilitarian. And if they try to summarize what tranquilism is about, they don't really mention, like they sort of mention it, but then it gets sort of shrugged under the carpet, the part where it's just a building block and you can care about people's life goals as well. And so maybe this sort of outreach just doesn't stick very well, or this sort of shaping of ways in which people might think about their values. It's kind of swimming upstream because there are just natural tendencies in communities to get kind of polarized, or to have a bit of a simplistic take on the outgroup. And that doesn't make it not worth doing. It's still worth doing, and it's probably a good thing. But it just means it won't be super effective necessarily.
Makes sense. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Let's go to Kat.
Hi, Lucas. Yeah, so in regards to, I know you had mentioned you're not fully on board with negative utilitarianism, which you were just kind of speaking to right now as well. But I was curious your thoughts on, when taking into consideration that maybe pursuing life goals is also important, what about when those goals, as so often does with many people, conflict with suffering-focused ethics? Like, for example, with capitalism out of control, people having these goals to grow as fast and as quickly as possible at the cost of causing suffering amongst other people, or expanding factory farms and such for profit-motivated goals that then cause intensive suffering to so many animals. I'm just curious what your thoughts are on that.
Yeah, so I am probably with you that those things aren't great, and that, so I'm not a libertarian. I kind of hate libertarianism, maybe I'm a libertarian in the like really weak sense that you shouldn't regulate stuff that is people's own business, but there's this slogan that someone's freedom ends where someone else's freedom is impaired, or however you phrase it. And if you pursuing your goals causes harm to others, then it would be good to interfere. And you have to find some kind of trade-off. Like, since on my view, both things are important, life goals are important and reducing suffering is important, I have to specify how I weigh them against each other. And I mean, I don't have like a formal recipe for it, but one intuition I have is that when I use the notion life goals, I mean something that is quite specific, and actually not every person has life goals. Like if we imagine, I wrote a post on this called the Life Goals Framework. And so it's not quite the same as just any sort of preference. So a life goal is like a really strong preference that you want to live your life after. And so if someone is just sitting in front of the TV the whole time and sort of wasting away their life, you could in a way say that this person doesn't have an active life goal. Maybe they have a life goal sort of in their ideal self, and they lack willpower to live according to it. And then obviously this person's goals still matter, but maybe they're just content existing the way they do, and they don't do anything in their life to accept short-term suffering in favor of long-term goals. So I think a life goal is when someone works for the future in a way where they might suffer more in the short term, but they do things that they consider meaningful enough personally to make up for that suffering. And that's kind of a good argument for people who are pure negative utilitarians, that there are things for which it's worth to take on suffering. Like if you imagine like a family struggling in the poverty line, but they work like multiple jobs so their children can go to university and have a better future, and then they're really happy when this day happens and the child gets accepted to like a scholarship. Then the hardships that these people went through had like a purpose, and they make up for something. And there are things that can be more important than suffering. It's just that involuntary suffering there's nothing that makes up for it. And so one person's life goal cannot be worth more than another person's strong involuntary suffering. At the very most, they're somewhat comparable, and possibly like depending on the scope of the suffering is even worse. And so since often great harms are at stake when we talk about like the future or like civilization scale factoring farming or space colonization, it's in my view, these things are only justified if we can be fairly confident that there won't be a lot of suffering. But it also depends on sort of the upsides that people perceive there to be. Because I think because basically some people see it as something, comparatively positive to reducing suffering when you create a really good future. And I don't agree with this view, but I don't think like antinatalism is just philosophically correct in a sense where you can say that it's not allowed for someone to let's imagine someone creates a future paradise where 99% of the population are like super happy and 1% suffers a lot, but not in a way that's worse than today's civilization. I just think that's like a defensible view to say that this is important to do. And the thing I would say that it's a bit like having children. Like, I think it's okay to have children even when you're not the sort of richest person in the world who can guarantee the absolute best resources for your child. But there is definitely maybe like a deontological or virtue ethical responsibility that if you put new people into the world, you should do your very, very best that they are taken care of. And if you're not going to do that, or if you're particularly badly set up for having children, then maybe it's unethical to have them. And so in the same way, I think about the future of civilization and like our choice to maybe colonize other planets or just continue civilization. If we're not set up well to do it really well, then maybe it would be unethical to do it poorly. And if we do decide to expand to other galaxies, it's like, it's our responsibility, and it's even the responsibility of people with symmetric values that they put in a lot of care into the prevention of ways in which things backfire and cause S risks. And only then I regard it as justifiable.
Awesome. Thank you, Lucas. And thank you for the question, Kat. We'll go to a pre-asked Slack question. This one from Dan Hageman, who asked, in what topics and cause areas do you think advocates of SFE need to be more conciliatory towards proponents of classical utilitarianism? And on what topics, if any, less conciliatory? You're muted, Lucas.
Yeah. So I thought that was an interesting question. You sent it to me in advance. I wasn't sure how exactly to interpret it, so I have like two answers. So the first one is, if we mean by conciliatory just the idea that there are different clusters of empirical views that often come with these different camps of normative views, then where are SFE people often right, and where would I say they might be wrong? So I think one thing that some suffering-focused people also think that the future will just be very negative in like all kinds of ways. And I'm not super convinced this has to be the case in expectation for symmetrical views, just because it's like more likely that the future will be extremely good than it will be extremely bad, even if it's overall unlikely for things to go well. Like the most of the ways in which the future goes poorly, it goes poorly in a way that isn't very optimized. And then the few times it goes really well, you can make a very great, very, very valuable future. And I think not everyone in suffering-focused circles underestimates this argument, but I would say some people maybe do, at least according to my stance. But then an area where suffering-focused people might be right, obviously, according to my views on moral anti-realism, is on this topic of moral uncertainty not always being mandatory, and then the option value argument. But others have written about this, so I'll just refer to when you look for option value argument on the EA forum. And then another way in which you could interpret conciliatory, being conciliatory, is, are either groups doing things that the other group gets really annoyed by. And I feel like I haven't followed those sort of discussions too much recently, but I get the impression that both sides are being like respectful and conciliatory in the good ways. So I don't think there is too much that I would change. Maybe one interesting thing that I recently thought people in the suffering-focused community could push more is that lately a bunch of AI alignment researchers have become more pessimistic about the tractability of alignment, especially on short AI timescales. And if that's really their view, they actually have lower opportunity costs now than they used to have, according to their own views, when they were more optimistic. And that might now be a good time to work on sort of plan B. And if AI timelines are short, and if alignment success is somewhat unlikely. Obviously, not everyone in AI alignment believes that. Many are still optimistic. But if you have become pessimistic, then now would be a good time to think about S-risk reduction, because maybe there's some low effort thing you could do that won't save the future, but it will at least make certain S-risks less likely. And now would be the time, if you are somewhat morally uncertain, or you have like a moral parliament view where 10% of your carrying capacity goes to S-risks while 90% goes into symmetrical stuff. And so that's something that maybe the suffering-focused people could push a bit more and say, if you really take suffering risk seriously, and if you really have become very pessimistic about your other avenues of having impact, maybe now is the time to work on S-risks.
Cool. Thank you, Lukas. That makes sense. Let's go to Marcus. We've got that. This may be the penultimate question, by the way. Marcus, over to you.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, this is a slightly shorter question. So I was just thinking, because you have been involved in the field long enough to see the literature and the field itself grow from a very small thing to something much bigger, and you're obviously very interested in doing good as well. So the fact that you've stayed in this area for so long seems to indicate that there's been some valuable progress that's been made. But if you're an anti-realist, what does this progress really look like?
Yeah, so I would think that as an anti-realist, progress is mostly in that you feel like you have a clearer picture of the option space, and you have the arguments fleshed out, or you have I don't think of progress in terms of we found the right thing and we can be confident that it's right in some elusive sense, but progress can mean that you're less confused about the options that you have available, but in the end you still have to choose. So I see the value of the whole discipline of philosophy. For me, is basically good philosophy is about explaining all the arguments that you have as an option and kind of ruling out positions that are internally inconsistent or make use of concepts or terminology that you can't really pin down and that only hide your confusion instead of kind of transforming confusion into, I know what the options are, I still have to decide, but at least I'm not confused about the options.
Thank you. And a final question is from Amorga Varsha. Apologies if I mispronounced that.
It's okay. Am I audible? Okay.
Yes, we can hear you.
Yeah, you can call me Amog. Okay. Hello, everyone. Hey, Lukas. First of all, thank you for all your work on formulation of suffering-focused ethics, moral uncertainty, and also some AI and suffering risk, tranquilism, and wild animal suffering. Thank you for all of your work. And today my question is about what are your personal thoughts on prevention of suffering? And I know you have already touched on the topic of antinatalism, but I'm asking this question with few considerations in my mind. My first consideration is, of course, like empathy towards all the people in the world, who are already born, and that's what we are focusing on. That is the reduction of suffering. And my second consideration is it about the economic incentives by the stakeholders who wants to fund the cause of reduction, but also wants people to create more people, because the end goal is to keep the economic machinery running. And my third consideration is, like, generally speaking, is it like everyone flawed in their own ways, and the same flawed people creating more people and with the hope of things are going to be perfect, even though they don't have the perfect picture of the world themselves? So these are my considerations, and I want to know your personal thoughts on the prevention of suffering rather than, the reduction of suffering.
Thanks for the bit at the end, because there was a part where I wasn't sure I understood everything, because there was some noise or some, but yeah, you said something about flawed people creating more flawed people, and this is sort of a process that continues to obviously have a lot of suffering, and also whether there's a way to like prevent suffering instead of just reduce it. And I think there is some hope for that, because if this AI transition goes well, which I'm not very optimistic about, but it's kind of a nice opportunity to start from scratch in a way and design things in new ways. And a lot of the problems that we have are because systems have just been slightly amended, and you add patches and fixes, but in the end someone could go back to the drawing board and design like a new future with the help of AIs. Like it could really be a deus ex machina where if technological progress really speeds up, that could be like I co-authored with Kaiser Dollar this paper, S-risks as a cause, superintelligence as a cause of cure for astronomical suffering. And there are visions where things will go well. And if we have a shot at all, it also goes through AI actually. And sort of our best hope without AI is probably only making things less bad, because humans are flawed. Unfortunately, I'm not actually that optimistic in practice, and I don't think this is very likely. I'm just saying, like, conceptually, this would be a possibility, but I think we would have to pause AI development and make sure to get things really right and solve a lot of coordination problems in the process, and only then we have even a shot of things working out well. But yeah.
Yeah, and also my second consideration was...
We're gonna wrap up there because we've only got 30 seconds left. But thank you for the question. Thank you again for your answer to that, Lukas, and all your other answers and your time today. And it's a really good way to kick off this course. Any final very brief thoughts from you, Lukas, before we wrap up?
No, if people have questions, they can, the organizers like you, Alistair, you have my email and people can ask you, and I allow you of sharing it. So people can get in touch that way, or I have EA Forum accounts, Less Wrong account. So you can reach me there for further questions. Thanks for having me on.
Super, thank you. PL, I forget your name. I'll try and get that option value paper and share that with everyone in the relevant channel. Yeah, I think that's it. Thank you everyone for your time. Have a lovely afternoon, morning, night, wherever you are.
You too. Thanks.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks, Lukas.
Nice. Thanks, David, for helping me out there.
Yep, should be good. I'll end the call.
Cool. Can you just let me know, will I get the recording and notes and stuff?
Right, let's see. I'm not sure. Yeah.
I'm gonna stop recording now.
Yeah.